So good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome. I'm Sarah McDougall, Director of Benary and Curator of the current exhibition, Sheer Verve, the Women's International Art Club. This evening's event is part of our accompanying programme of related talks. And before we begin, just the usual housekeeping note to remind you that the event is being recorded. So please keep your cameras and volume off throughout the speakers' presentations to lessen any possible interference. The chat function will be open throughout, so please type your questions into the thread for our Q&A at the end. So I'm really delighted to be joined this evening by our very distinguished expert panel for what I know is going to be a really lively, fluid and hopefully organic discussion about Bloomsbury and Bloomsbury Women. Frances Spalding, CBE, is an art historian, critic and biographer with a specialist interest in 20th century British art. She's published widely on the Bloomsbury Group, including biographies of Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant and Roger Fry. Grace Brockington is Associate Professor of the History of Art at the University of Bristol. She has written and lectured on modern British art, war and puppetry, Vanessa Bell's experimental work, book illustration and universal visual language. And John King is Research Assistant on Women and the Arts at the National Gallery, London. He has an interest in early 20th century British art and completed his PhD on Vanessa Bell. So the panel have asked me to kick off this evening with the first slide, which I think John's going to bring up for us. And this is the work that we've included in the exhibition, Sheer Verve. And it's there really to fulfill a number of functions. So I was very keen to represent Vanessa Bell as an important and well-known 20th century British artist. It's perhaps surprising that she showed with the Women's International Art Club, as she was very well known within her own right at this date. She showed only once in 1938. And she showed a still life. We don't know exactly which one. So this is to stand in for that still life. I was keen to balance the lesser known and the celebrated women artists within the group in the exhibition. And also the still life and the interior are both very important and consistent motifs, as we will see within Bell's art. And finally, it has been located within her Charleston studio, and that allows us to think about the concept of a room of one's own, famously coined by her sister, Virginia Woolf, the importance of interiority in the art of Bloomsbury, and the importance of independent and creative spaces for women. And I'm going to hand over now to Grace to speak more about that.
Yes, so this is a relatively late work in Bell's career. She died in 1961, so she would have been in her 50s when she made this painting. And the wonderfully rich and subtle colour palette which we find in this work is sort of typical of her later still lives. But as so often with Bell's work, the meaning, the significance of the work is diffused throughout the canvas, and the background is very important. There's this sort of interesting and ambiguous detail on the left-hand side, this sort of abstracted arrangements of squares, which is hard to pin down, but would seem to gesture towards an earlier phase of her career when she was making quite radically abstract paintings and doing sort of avant-garde decorative work for her interior design company, the Omega Workshops. There's something in this painting which seems to follow the trajectory of her whole career in the gesture towards the early work and then moving in the foreground towards the in some ways more conventional interest in the still life, which was typical of her later career. The detail in the corner on the left-hand side is ambiguous. It looks abstract, but in fact, if you do the sort of art historical detective work, it is possible to pin it down to something more specific in her domestic environment, in her life. And I think Frances is able to tell us a bit more about that specific location.
If we could move to the next slide, that would be helpful to show where this comes from, because somebody has wonderfully put these red lines around two pictures. Firstly, to show you that little bit at the corner of the, one has directed your attention to the hoop sort of like decoration that runs along the side of the mantelpiece that runs over the fireplace. There's a pither stove behind one of the figures standing in front of it. I have to say it is all Vanessa Bell's family who is more or less shown in this picture. Her husband Quentin, her 3 children and some grandchildren. But what fascinates us this evening is the fact that she wanted in this picture to let us know that actually where this picture was painted. If you look at the red circle on the picture, you will see that it pushes the cloth has been pushed forward a little to expose part of that decoration around that mantelpiece. So we can be certain, and also with, as Grace mentioned, that yellow, white and purple stripes and the top left-hand side do relate to the colour of the square on the right of the Buddha. It's a kind of yellow ochre come orange, and then there's a white frame around it, and then there's the purple stripe that we see in this picture. So those 2 sides of the painting actually perfectly affirm that Vanessa Bell painted this oil painting in the studio, the downstairs studio at Charleston, added on between the wars, and shared between her and Duncan. Duncan Grant. They were often painting together in the studio. After the war, part of an attic room was transformed into a personal studio for Vanessa Bell. So sometimes after that, they were painting in different parts of the house. Not always, but anyway, there you go. The studio at Charleston is the context for the making of this work.
And I think as well, Francis, it's a really great comparison that we have here between the work that has been exhibited at Ben Uri and this photograph of the studio in which we see Vanessa Bell's family, and we see that the creative legacy and the familial legacy come hand in hand, and they're all centered around this idea of domesticity and the domestic space as a creative and familial space. The studio was somewhere in which the children would come in and out of. It was not a space in which they were excluded. And here we can see 2 of her children represented by Quentin Bell on the far right.
3 of her children.
Yes, well, and her 2 of her children, Quentin Bell on the right and Angelica Garnett in the photograph, on the mantelpiece.
Yes,
so we can kind of see there this legacy being monumentalized through the photograph, but that it comes back to this creative interior that we see in the painting itself. That I feel like there's that interesting connect between the 2, and so it'd be interesting to explore those ideas more within this talk about the idea of family and homemaking that the painting kind of brings out.
Yes, absolutely. And I apologise for muddling Olivia Bell with Vanessa Bell herself. They did look a bit alike.
Well, I was thinking the same myself. I was thinking, depending on the stage of life we're seeing them in, the similarities are remarkable. We're seeing Bell's actual family over here, but of course, Charleston, the home she created, accommodated all sorts of families, the families of that, the blood relations, families of friends, and that's something we can go into more as we talk.
Perfect, yes, and that's a brilliant segue into the idea of home and how domestic spaces were important to Vanessa Bell. So I think we should really go back to who Vanessa Bell was for those listeners who aren't so familiar with her. Francis, could you start us off there?
Yes. Well, she was a Victorian. She was the daughter of Leslie Stephen and Julia Duckworth. She was the second wife of Leslie Stephen. Leslie Stephen was a hugely energetic man of letters. He published numerous books and articles and edited the first 26 volumes of the Dictionary of National Biography. Inevitably, this man was embedded in the culture of late Victorian life in Britain, and he knew a great many people. one of the first to ask Vanessa Stephen, as she then was, to paint a portrait was Lady Robert Cecil. You can see her sitting in the background of the photograph on the left. That was quite a prestigious commission, admittedly from a friend of the family, so there we go. But the person on the right is a much freer, more freer individual. You'll notice that she's wearing very simplistic clothes and with a bandana tied around her head. And where Vanessa Bell is here, she's now married to Clive Bell, but she's in about this period, she's already become associated with Duncan Grant, both emotionally and professionally. And she's a woman in her own right. So I think that the tremendous journey that she's made was partly to establish true houses. In 1904, her mother having already died, her father died, and she took it on herself to move her 3 siblings off to Bloomsbury, as you know, a part of London, south of the 3 great termini, Euston, St Pancras and King's Cross. And in this still fairly respectable area, professional middle classes lived there, she re-established a home for the family, leaving behind the more fashionable Kensington and shocking her aunts in doing so. But this home enabled them to live as they wished. Many of the walls were painted white. Before the furniture had been properly recovered, she flung over them paisley shawls and things and loved the sight of strong colour against white walls. She hung up portraits of her great aunt, Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs, including several of her mother. And it was an amazing place. It was, of course, here that Bloomsbury was invented. She and her brother Toby decided to send out cards. We can actually see some of them. They exist still, saying "at home" at 10 o'clock in the evening for cocoa and something else. So it wasn't going to be a lavish delivery of good food and drink. It was just going to be an end of the evening thing, something you went to after you'd had your supper or dinner and wanted to talk. It was the fact that Toby was at Cambridge and could bring to these at homes his Cambridge friends that brought to the creation of Bloomsbury a kind of Cambridge intelligence. A desire to question things, to ask what makes for the good life, and so on. And this was an extraordinary event that led on to the creation of what we call today Bloomsbury, a group of people coming together, including Maynard Keynes and Toby Stephen, and also Virginia Stephen, who then married one of Toby's friends, Leonard Woolf. And these individuals gathered together, not because they shared any political belief or any manifesto, but simply because they wanted to talk, to argue, to rethink how things should be. And you can see it from one of the later paintings by Vanessa Bell about 1911. Here they are sitting around, simply talking and discussing. The fact that Bloomsbury lasted so many years, it went on until many of these people had died, is the fact that they continued to meet in houses. First of all, in this one in Gordon Square in Bloomsbury, number 46. Later at Charleston, and also at Rodmell, where Virginia and Leonard Woolf set up a house. And these were important centres for discussion, exchange, gossip, all sorts of things, which helped the group endure for much longer than most groups endure. And this is partly why they've had such influence on us.
Yes, I mean, one of the things they like to talk about, of course, was politics. They had some quite radical ideas about how one could live in the modern world and how their lives might be different, could be reimagined, and the decoration and the redecoration of their homes was all part of that reimagining of a modern life. And that's something which is recorded in Bell's many paintings and drawings of the homes she created. I think it's worth remembering that the Cambridge colleges, which her brother went to, his friends, the Dante came friendly, they were all male environments at that stage. So there one or two women's colleges, otherwise it was a homosocial world. So the coming out of that sort of Cambridge to Bloomsbury and sort of be welcomed by Vanessa Stevens and her sister and other women would have changed the sort of gender dynamic of the group in a very interesting way.
Yes, and I think it's important to remember as well just how radical these meetups were, not only intellectually, but pushing the boundaries of both gender and sexuality. So thinking of Asham in particular, a place in which Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf hosted homosexual men and actively encouraged sexual relationships between them. And there are letters of this period in which Vanessa Bell proactively, there's a letter that famously she sent to John Maynard Keynes, kind of asking about particular sexual activities he'd got up to at Asham when they'd left him there. So this is a place in which they are breaking all sorts of boundaries, and it seems like nothing's off the cards.
Yeah. Can I just mention how they got rid of their aunts and neighbours from Kensington, who came to some of these at homes at first, because one of the games they played was you give a letter from the alphabet, and that someone was asked to produce as many words and names they could think of as quickly as possible, beginning with that letter. So when a G was held up, somebody started off with Jerusalem and Jesus. And of course, that wasn't quite the thing that the aunts and visitors wanted to hear. So that's, in that way, the shocked ones just stayed away and therefore left this clarified group to proceed.
Okay, so it'd be interesting in this context to think, returning to Vanessa Bell and this still life, thinking about as these boundaries were being broken, as Bloomsbury was forming, how the still life appears in a way that's remarkably different to the one that we see in Sheer Verve. So I wonder if we could go a bit more into Iceland poppies as a quite famous example from 1909, Frances.
I think many people at that time very much admired Whistler and the way he very carefully selected his tonal relationships in his paintings and simplified his imagery. And here you see her having 3 bands in the background, 3 objects in front of it, and then 3 Iceland poppies in the foreground. Possibly there's a reference to sleep, with the green medicine bottle and the poppies themselves having an association with sleep. But it's a beautifully restrained and elegant. It was much praised by Sickert, which is rather nice, when it was exhibited in 1909. Just going back 1 minute, I think that perhaps her joking teasing of Maynard Keynes was of his sexual life was a bit of a tease, and a wanting to have this sort of frankness and so on with him about it. But I don't think she actively encouraged him. I don't think he needed any encouragement.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me, by the way? I lost my internet momentarily.
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yes, I was just thinking, I mean, in some ways, Bloomsbury relationships were very experimental. They're pushing sort of ignoring the boundaries really all the time. Very fluid, sort of unpredictable. But at the same time, as Frances has already said, they were tremendously long lasting. And somehow it's sort of within a particular, there's a sort of, friendships were allowed to be fluid, but at the same time, they were sort of expected to last. There was a sort of an interesting mixture of stability, but also instability, which I think is characteristic of the group. It's sort of a stability which grew out of a mutual tolerance, I suppose.
Where are we moving on to after this?
Could I just pop in there to say, I was struck by your Frances talking about the gathering of the 3 things, 2 lots of 3 things, and of course the triangular relationships within Bloomsbury are also such a famous facet of it, whether you think that has anything to do with it or whether it's simply a beautiful still life.
It was not quite as triangular as it later became, let's say in 1909. But it certainly does become something she repeats in a painting called The Tub, where she has a vase of 3 poppies in the background, as if the number 3 is a comment on the life at Charleston at that time. Baths being tin baths, of course. Yes, but it's interesting why she chose three things, one red and two white and so on.
Mm.
Well, what we're talking about here with this painting is the significance of particular dates within Vanessa Bell's life. So we've looked at 1904, which we consider the beginning of Bloomsbury, to the extent that her father had died and she moved from, as you said, Francis, Kensington to the less fashionable Bloomsbury. Iceland Poppy sits just before another significant date for Vanessa Bell and, of course, Bloomsbury and, of course, British modernism more widely. So I'll just read out a quote by Virginia Woolf from 1924 when she's reflecting on this period. So she says, on or about December 1910, human character changed. All human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics and literature. Let us agree to place one of those changes about the year 1910. So I wanted to really ask the question for our audience, what is it about 1910 that's so significant?
Mm-hmm.
Are the audience able to reply?
For you, Francis, for our audience, so that they can understand why.
Well, there's a major edition of the encyclopedia, the famous encyclopedia, which seemed to sum up and give you everything the world was about and needed. But of course, it was also something that marked a development from which you could not go forward because of the forthcoming war. So it seemed a moment of peace and change and stability and everything, but actually it was very different. Yes, someone's put up the fact that it was the death of Edward VII, and indeed the country went into a great performance of mourning, purple chocolates, purple things on chocolates, and really very tremendous, almost like what we had after the death of Lady Diana. So it was a very dramatic moment in many ways. But for the artists, the key thing was the first post-impressionist exhibition titled Manet and the Post-Impressionists, which Roger Fry mounted in a gallery in London, going to Paris to select the paintings and wanting to show what we had ignored really for 30 years, which was the development out of Impressionism into Post-Impressionism. In 1905, when Durand-Ruel brought an exhibition of Impressionism to London, nobody bought a picture, hardly anything sold. Durand-Ruel was furious and most surprised when the Americans were still fighting over them to get them before us. So the problem here was that it was an attack on a sort of very established aesthetic. When people like Alma Tadema was very, very popular and people paid large sums of money for his paintings of ancient Greece and domestic scenes in ancient Greece and Rome. And if you turn from Alma Tadema to a Van Gogh, the audience was absolutely baffled. What is this crude kind of art painting going on? It's like a child's picture, some thought. And people spat at the paintings, they laughed at them. Men had to be removed from the gallery because they were laughing so much. It was a tremendous challenge to what the aesthetic of beauty was to the British audience at that date. We were just so very out of date. It's only about 30 miles. Yes, here we see a very good example of Matisse, which was included in the second Post-Impressionist exhibition, when an entire room was given to Matisse. And you can see how people were very, very worried by this kind of loose work. In fact, Violet Bonham Carter complained to Roger Fry that the legs weren't very well drawn. And Roger Fry said, well, don't look at the legs, look at the spaces left between the legs and get a sense of this sort of bounding rhythm created by this simple group dance. Notice how the hands don't quite meet up in one place. It's as if to invite the viewer to imaginatively join in with this fantastic dance. It was, of course, a trial painting for really a large wall painting to go in Shoshukin's home in Moscow, where it would be at the top of a staircase and invite you to climb up the staircase with the energy needed for this dance. But notice the simplicity of method and technique.
Mm. And Belle was very quick to pick up on these experimental techniques, wasn't she? And to work them out for herself. British art sometimes sort of suffers from the accusation of being derivative of the European, but I think Belle is one of the artists who helps to make the case against that, because what she did was, in many ways, a response to what she was seeing in these exhibitions, and also when she travelled in Europe and in France, she went there a lot. But there's no doubt she made something of her own out of them. There is a distinctive quality to Belle's modernism, which I think puts her in conversation, if you like, with her European contemporaries.
Yes, it's extraordinary how radical she became almost overnight, isn't it? Mm. Perhaps we're going to see more of that, are we?
Yes, so I think what's interesting is that with the two post-impressionist exhibitions, what we are seeing is the transition between what was a very private group to a very public group, a group that is spoken much about in public discourse, not always favorably, as you say, Francis. And after the post-impressionist exhibitions, we have the Amiga workshops set up by Fry, but directed by Roger Fry, Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. And this ran between 1913 and 1919. Could you go a bit more into that and the significance of the Amiga workshops and the way in which it related to the post-impressionist exhibitions?
Well, one of the things that Fry in particular loved was peasant art. It was something that was done with feeling and freedom and not sort of curtailed by machine production or strict laws of rules according to style. He thought it was joyful. He thought it was a way of creating decoration that enlivened a home. And so he encouraged a very, very bold thing of not only painting decorations on candlesticks here, but also furniture, tabletops, screens. And then he said, come on, we must do some textiles. And I think Grace has got to help me here. Is it a Vanessa Bell textile in the top left there?
Gosh, that's a good question. You can't always tell them apart, can you?
I believe it is, because I have a coaster which of that print which attributes it to Vanessa Bell.
Well, that settles it then. Yes, but I mean, not all the work was signed deliberately. It's meant to be a community effort. It had that sort of arts and crafts quality, I suppose. What it didn't have was the arts and crafts emphasis on the sort of excellence of workmanship. This is very much about artistic inspiration, about sort of spontaneity of execution. They were trying to bring the spirit of European modernism, post-impressionism into the British home. And they did it by decorating every surface of the furniture which they sold, and with these extraordinary sort of revolutionary patterns.
And if you mentally or imaginatively place beside that piece of fabric an example of William Morris's patterns and his tight use of birds and berries and foliage and so on, you can see how rakeaway Vanessa Bell's style is. Really sort of extraordinary. It must have had a glimpse of Cubism by now, I think, but it's very, very radical. It wasn't until the 20s and 30s that other designers of fabrics caught up with this.
It was in sort of 1913 to 1914, just as Amiga was getting going, really, that Bell was making her most radical, sort of extreme experimentations with abstraction on canvas, as John's just showing us here on the left-hand side, is one of those abstracts on canvas, which abstraction is an idea, a movement, an invention, really, which was really sort of picking up speed in Europe, and Bell is one of the early practitioners of this idea. This abstract painting, which is now on view in Tate, you can see it there, has eliminated, so far as it's possible, any representational content. Of course, the thing about abstraction is you can never entirely eliminate representation, because she's representing squares. But this sort of reference to the outside world, the figurative content, has gone. We put it next to another of her Omega fabric designs to show the close connection between the fine art, the work on canvas, which is designed for the gallery, and her domestic designs, the art she lived with, the art she made for her home.
Yes, it's lovely, isn't it? This sense of that some of the designs that she did at this time, it's difficult to say, could it be a design for a rug? Is it really an abstract painting, or is it a rug design? And we're not absolutely clear. But it seems to be, just looking at this choice you put here together, there's a much more fluid use in the textile of a movement across and through, and working out how to repeat, where the repeat will begin and end, and so on. Whereas there is this architectonic or architectural quality to the abstraction on the left there, which which seems to emerge from actual paintings, from interiors in particular.
Yeah, and very often, as I think we'll see further on in the PowerPoint, she incorporates these decorative and abstracted details into her figurative or her semi-figurative work in a way which again ties them into her lived environment.
Yes, I mean, this photograph taken in the Omega workshops, which incidentally was in Fitzroy Square, wasn't it? In a wonderful 18th century or Regency house, it must have been an absolute riot for visitors to look at the way the wall is decorated, the screen behind, and then these extraordinary clothes that they're wearing, one of which is worn by Nina Hamlet. Incidentally, both Nina Hamlet and Winifred Gill were very loyal members of the Omega workshops, and it's owing to Winifred Gill, particularly a series of letters she got out of Duncan Grant about his memories of the Omega, that helped put it into history, into historical form. But Nina Hamlet very happily acted as a model and flung round herself, the woman on the left, this beautiful, extraordinary, almost incoherent design for the Omega shawl or cloak. Shall we pursue with Nina Hamlet, because she's a very interesting figure. We've been asked to think about Bloomsbury artists, and she's certainly an important one. Sickert, I mentioned earlier, admired Vanessa Bell's Iceland poppies, but he was also hugely impressed by Nina Hamlet, by her as an artist. She'd managed to get herself out to Paris just before the outbreak of war. And although she was there not very long, she managed to become very much more up to date about modern art in that time. So she was very much in tune with what was going on in the Omega and made a great contribution in many ways. She didn't mind what she had to do. She was willing to do it. One summer, Sickert decided to go with his wife to live in Bath for a couple of months, and so he rented a house, and he insisted that Nina Hamlet should come too, and booked her into a sort of B&B nearby. And she arrived at it, and when she knocked on the door, the landlady who opened it had such a fierce and memorable face and manner that she there and then decided she absolutely had to paint her. If by any chance you've got a column of figures, heads blocking out this picture on the right, do move them so you can see it fully, because it's a remarkably strong painting in which the huge pattern on the wallpaper behind echoes the shade for the lamp. There's a music stand behind the lamp, and then behind that is a telescope, which ends just beside a very delicate cup and saucer. But the whole thing is rigidly worked into a pattern that fits very well into the shape and size of the canvas. It's that once seen, it's unforgettable painting. If we go on to the next slides, we see two more paintings by Nina Hamlet, who was not only an artist, but also wrote two autobiographies. One was, the second one was called, can anybody help me with this? I can't remember. The Laughing Torso, thank you, whoever helped me with that. And the second was called Is She a Lady? ? By which time the answer was, I'm afraid, rather not, rather no. But anyway, she was a very lively and intelligent woman, very independent. And I can see, if compared with the one I've just shown you of the landlady, this one of a woman reading is not quite so fierce and formal, but it's still a very beautifully shaped and put together painting. And as I said, I think there's a kind of satisfying tensity between her attention given to the picture plane and to the suggestion of pictorial design. But so strong were some of her portraits that Jean Cocteau once said of her portraits, they were plus vrai que le vrai, more true than truth. But she could be various. She did some landscapes which are variously moving in their way. And then I show you on the right there a small, very small painting, smaller than it seems, which almost reminds me of its of Gwen John in its attention to colour and tone and the simplicity of it. So she was an interesting person, but had a very tough life. If we move on, I think we find another Bloomsbury woman artist who we might keep in mind in tonight's talk, and that is Dora Carrington. A very strong-minded person who, when she got to the Slade, dropped her name Dora, which she hated, and insisted on being called simply Carrington. And John Nash fell in love with her, Mark Gertler fell in love with her, and so on. She was not much chaste, but the person, unfortunately, that she fell in love with was a very extraordinary man called Lytton Strachey, one of the Bloomsbury group, very witty, very funny, very intelligent, and she wanted only to be with him. And so they first set up house together. If you could go back to the slide before, you see the first house that she found for him, which was Tidmarsh Mill. And there she made it possible for him to live very happily, receive visitors and so on. And she made a painting of it, which you see here, which is extraordinary in its brilliance and density. She was very much moved by the Pre-Raphaelites, and before the First World War, in very quick succession, almost one year after another, the Tate Gallery mounted an exhibition of Pre-Raphaelite painting, and she was thrilled by it and went to both exhibitions. So what we see here is not so much Bloomsbury painting, though she's often referred to as a Bloomsbury painter, but as a piece of Pre-Raphaelitism, but married perhaps to a modern sense of colour, perhaps, because this is a marriage between two things to give this almost sort of visionary portrayal of the house. If we go back to the further on to the portrait of Lytton again, you can see in her portrait of him reading, his wonderful long fingers holding the book. The book is not actually open, but he was passionate about books. He spent a greater part of the day reading. And she very much enjoyed making a way of life in the house they lived in, and then moved on to another one afterwards, whereas as she observed at one point that it seemed very ordinary in many ways. His life was like that of the chickens, getting fed, scratching about, not moving very much, not going anywhere. And but nevertheless, it was a remarkable, rich life of the mind, as she could see going on behind those spectacles and behind those eyes. She adored him, and when he died young, relatively young, she found that although he'd taught her how to live, how to read, how to enjoy life, she had not taught her how to go on living without him. And so she got hold of a gun that was used to shoot rabbits and shot herself and took her own life. Very sad moment in the history of Bloomsbury, much affected by it were certainly Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf and many others.
Yes, and I suppose we might see Carrington as someone who's producing work that is very different to the work that we've seen by Vanessa Bell so far, and yet and also Nina Hamlet, but we're seeing them all as Bloomsbury women. So it's interesting to think about what makes a Bloomsbury woman. I suppose part of it are the personal connections that she has, the network that she builds, the idea of being part of Bloomsbury, which in some ways is a group, although unofficially, and in other ways is a sort of family, as well as a friendship group, a sort of family that is chosen rather than a traditional sort of family. So it's interesting here to think about domesticity.
Yes, it wasn't.
Sorry, just heard a bit. Sorry, what unites these women is this idea of an anti-normative version of the home that we see explored and yearned for in Bloomsbury domesticities, particularly by the women who encouraged and sat at the heart of them. So with that, we can return to Vanessa Bell. And we have, in this period, still the Omega period, as we might call it, paintings which show the domestic interior and its importance to her creatively, in quite an abstract way. It's an abstracted form of the interior. And I wonder if we could speak a bit more about that, Frances.
Well, it's abstracted inside and out, because through that French window you see the path outside, the lawn, and then this white wall of the edge of the garden. So everything yet seems to be worked out as its role within the whole, on the flat, on the pictorial surface, as well as in the actual things in the picture. That lovely stripe of orange red from the curtain, ending at repeated in a slightly different colour in the wine red stocking that Jessie Edshills is showing as she sits on the floor painting. There was a moment before that, Grace, you wanted to say something.
Yes, well, I think I'm afraid I lost my connection and went out again. I can't actually remember what it was, and clearly discussions moved on. So let's stick with this picture. Have you mentioned the faces and the blanking out of the faces?
We have not. No.
Okay, yeah, I think that's one of the most distinctive and in a sense sort of exciting things about Belle's painting from this period, but also much later. It's something which remains consistent in her work. It relates in some ways to her abstract phase, which was starting about now and sort of becoming increasingly radical from between 1912 and 1914. But it abstracts the faces, but there's a bit more to it than that. I've always felt it's not so much a sort of effacing of personality, it's a diffusion of personality through the whole picture plane. There's a sense of character being expressed and also identified in the whole physique of the person and in the interior which surrounds them, I feel.
It's wonderful, because if you imagine that she had painted in the nose and the mouth and the eyes, it would delay you, wouldn't it? It would attract attention and prevent this kind of rich boldness that brings everything together in a sweep, almost like a one sweep.
Yeah,
we missed out mentioning this when we saw the photograph of her portrait of Virginia Woolf.
Yes, earlier
this time at the end we go back.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going back. Okay, there we are. Yes.
Yeah.
This is the end of a series of, is it 3 or 4 paintings that she did all one summer of a year. It began with one of her sitting at a table with her arms across her, in front of her, which Roger Fry painted at the same time. And Vanessa Bell, with great sort of precision, just simply quickly paints in eyes, mouth, nose, in the face, adequately to immediately recognize and identify the sort of rather beautiful features that Virginia Woolf had. The next one is painted sitting in an armchair, crocheting. It's in the National Portrait Gallery, and she has begun to put in these facial features, and then she's blurred them, which is interesting, suggesting perhaps movement maybe, or that we can't quite see what she looks like. But when she got to this one in the deck chair, you can see that she has deliberately decided not to give any features at all. And yet, because of the pose and everything and what we know about Virginia Woolf and who painted it and so on, we immediately recognize her. So in some way which the body itself can communicate personality. But what that blank face is to challenge us, to say, what do you see in this face? What can you bring to your knowledge of this person to fill that empty space? What does it say? And one of the things that it said to me was that if you painted someone on July the 12th, 1912, roughly somewhere where this painting was done, that person would not look like that for very long. And so by removing the facial features, you actually open it out to a longer period of time where you can look at this portrait and think of her interest in interiority, her interest in sort of the submerged, the hidden, and so on, and bring to it also our knowledge of the books that she eventually wrote after appalling breakdowns. Very bad one in 1915 when she completely lost her sanity. And yet, of course, this was painted before that. And yet this woman goes on to write, Virginia Woolf goes on to write some of the most influential novels of the 20th century, still read today, still the inspiration for conferences in countries around the world which are very different to our own.
Yes, what's so striking, as you alluded to, Francis, about these faceless paintings by Vanessa Bell is just how recognisable the person is, despite the fact that their faces are absent. But on the topic of faceless paintings, it brings us to one of Vanessa Bell's most well-known and radical paintings, in which there are no faces, not because they're faceless, but because we only see the backs of people.
Yes.
And here we have what viewers for the first time, when they see it, is quite a confusing image. It's one in which we don't immediately know what it is that we are seeing, and then maybe piece by piece we start to understand. So this is her painting Dublin Beach, currently at Tate, which is arguably one of her most well-known paintings, and definitely one of her most radical in terms of early abstraction. And we are seeing the simplification of the coastline through this diagonal sweep across the canvas, and the way in which the sea and the sky, or what might just be the sea, exists in one's blue, a sweep of blue along at the top half of the canvas. So what is it that we're seeing here, and how does it play into what it is that we're talking about with regards to Vanessa Bell and the importance of domesticity and interiority?
You only have to envision this painting beside an Alma Tadema to be absolutely astonished by its emptiness. The very middle of the painting is more or less empty. You know, how dare she do this when Alma Tadema and many other artists at that time were stuffing their pictures full of interest and so keeping it well balanced and beautifully portrayed. And she's just got rid of so much. I mean, there's nobody else quite like this at this time to Vanessa Bell. It's extraordinary what she's doing. We do have a study for this in oil, in which there's some rocks the other side of the beach, just by the edge of the water. We have a woman standing of that bathing tent, which she was supposed to change her clothes in. You weren't allowed to strip off on the sands in those days. With a sort of lovely flowing bend to her body, a lovely sort of elegant style. But in the final product, which we see here, she rips away those rocks at the edge, and she's just got things so boldly out. She's beneath that deep blue of the seas. If you look closely at the painting when you're next in the Tate, you can see that she's got an underpaint of red. And simultaneously, the sand has got an underpaint of, in places, a sort of bluey colour to force up the colour above it. It's the most extraordinary picture. I would just like to say that when Roger Fry went to Paris in I can't remember if it was 15 or what, he went to see Matisse, and he showed him photographs of recent work by Vanessa Bell and others. I wonder if he showed Matisse this one, because you notice down her back is a kind of pigtail-like straight bar of hair. And just at that moment, Matisse was making a sculpture series called Les Deux, and none of them had that motif until this moment. And then he suddenly adds in this thick plait of hair down the back of one sitter. Just possible she was influenced. Matisse was influenced by Vanessa Bell. However, it's a wonderful painting. What I would like to say is that clearly at some point recently it's had some conservation work, I think, done on it, and they've taken it off the stretcher. Now, whether I don't know enough about it to say, but I think since then they've reframed it with this frame not showing. I may be wrong about that, but I think it's laid out the canvas so every bit of it can be seen, and you can see in the top left-hand corner and the bottom right, and a little bit in the sort of top left corner and left bottom, and on the right. But clearly the canvas has been folded round a frame at some point. I doubt that Vanessa Bell wanted us to see this frame we're looking at today, and yet it is wonderfully enticing to see it because it shows the sort of softness around the edge of the painting, her doubts and so on about it, testing of colours maybe. And I welcome the opportunity to see it in this condition for a while, not always.
But the art historian Lisa Tickner has read this work in terms of a sort of profound nostalgia for Belle's own childhood in Cornwall and her mother, who died when Belle was relatively young. And myself, I do find that reading convincing. There's a warmth and a sort of tenderness and a melancholy to it, which I think helps to make sense of the austereness of the spaces.
It's one thing we haven't mentioned, the importance of the sea to, well, it's important more to her sister, I suppose, but for 13 summers, they went down to part of St. Ives, the outskirts of St. Ives, to live in a rented house that they'd taken a lease on for 13 years. And it must have had a very formative influence on them. I mean, they went not just for 2 or 3 weeks, but two, 3, and sometimes 4 months in the summer, taking the servants, the dogs, everything in the train all the way down there with them. But it after the nature of London and the soot and all the problems of living in London then as well as now, it must have had a huge effect on them and liberated them in a way that's very important. And so it's not surprising that, as Lisa Tickler says, that she made that place the source of this work.
And Tickler, of course, discusses in depth the change in tourism industry at this time and the domestication of the beach itself, in which the beach becomes a sort of, as you were saying, Grace, a very sentimental, quite comforting place for Belle, but also more widely. And what we have here in Tickner's view is this struggle that Belle is having, because it is quite a bleak picture as well. It is one in which motherhood is called into question, and she is she is in conflict with this idea of the angel in the house and her own mother as being as a Victorian version of a domestic goddess in a way, and having all the virtues attached to that. And here we have her modern version of motherhood and her trying to work through what her own position as a mother actually is in relation to domesticity as well, which, as we know, is deeply interlinked with motherhood.
Yeah. Don't forget that her mother died young when she was what? I know Virginia Woolf was 13 when her mother died. So
she was 16, was she? Or 15, yes. And
they never went, well, Leslie Stephen refused to go to that part of Cape Cornwall again. So they had abruptly cut off from the house they lived in.
So it's something that is important to her, the beach, and it's something that also holds a lot of traumatic associations as well.
Yes.
Sarah, how much time do we have left?
We have very little time, I'm afraid. Okay. So if we could start drawing to a close of the discussion so that we can invite our audience to ask some questions. I know there's been a lot of comments throughout, which I'm afraid we haven't been able to relay back to the speakers so as not to stop this lovely flow of conversation back and forth. But it would be lovely to squeeze in a couple. So I don't know if you could just find a good slide to finish on, John, and then we'll try and bring in our audience for a few minutes. Yes,
I suppose a good way to finish would be to just think about, we've been speaking a lot about how the domestic space was very important to all of these Bloomsbury women, but for Vanessa Bell in particular, we haven't spoken about Charleston, which is one of the most well-known homes that she inhabited and created with Duncan Grant in 1916. So it'd be good to think about the context of that creation within a traumatic time for the world, really, when we're thinking about the First World War. And so just kind of ending on what the domestic space offers in a time of uncertainty. And I wonder if, Grace, if you could kind of summarize that here.
Yeah, but yes, and well, the Triple Alliance, the work on the left, it's an unusual work in Belle's oeuvre because it's one of the very few places where she actually makes or begins to make an explicitly political statement. This is, it's a domestic still life, it's a lamp and 2 bottles on a table. It's also a collage at a moment when European modernists like Picasso were doing very interesting work with collage. So it's sort of very sort of radical work as part of their Cubist phase. And if you go and look at this work where it's hung in Leeds, and you look closely and you sort of tilt your head from side to side, you discover that the background is made up of a collage of newspaper cuttings, many of which make reference to the current conflict. It's and this technique of it, including reference to current events in the works, has the potential to make quite a significant political statement. It's worth remembering that Bell, like most of her Bloomsbury friends, were pacifists during the First World War. They had a strongly felt conviction that that particular war was wrong, not least because, not just because of the loss of life, but because of the way it disrupted their vision of a common European culture. The Charleston farmhouse, which they moved to in 1916, became in some ways a safe space in the context of the war, a place where they could be themselves away from a culture which had become increasingly reactionary in their view. Thank you for putting this image up. It's so sort of evocative of their lives at Charleston, the sense of being inside, looking outside at the world, at a pond which in itself is reflecting the world, it's reflecting the sky and the trees around it. So at that particular moment during the First World War, interiority becomes something which has the potential to express a very unpopular political position, but in a very sort of subtle and indirect sort of way.
Thank you so much, Grace, and I'm sorry to hurry you all. There are 2 questions that have come through which seem a really good way to end the discussion tonight. So if you'd each like to sort of say a brief sentence on those. So one is, what is the legacy that the Bloomsbury women have left us? And another is, and perhaps we do them in reverse, what was the or in what ways did Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell influence each other, and did they in fact influence each other's work because of their closeness? We could start with that one, maybe Grace, and then John.
The legacy, well, I think that there are lots of ways of answering that question. I think that the one I'll plumb for is the possibility for having a creative life at the same time as a domestic life, as being a mother, as running a home, and being an artist, but not seeking to demarcate those areas of activity in any particular way. In a sense, finding a way to do it all, I think, could be one way of putting it. As for the relationship between Woolf and Bell, yes, it was very close, not just personally, but also creatively, and that there is a lot of scholarship exploring that creative relationship and the way they influenced each other's works. I think at one point we mentioned, or did we mention it? I can't remember whether it just came up in our pre-discussion that Bell's painting 3 Women, also known as Conversation, it was directly associated in the minds of the sisters with Woolf's short story Kew Gardens, for example. Both of them hinging around the idea of conversation and how it operates between people and within social groups. Thanks for bringing that up, John.
Yeah, and just to follow from Grace, I'd briefly like to say that there are various legacies that you could argue the Bloomsbury women have, but more than anything, it's to not be afraid to do it yourself and to have the sort of creative domestic interior that celebrates idiosyncrasy, that celebrates personal expression in a way that I feel like we've lost as a culture. and that it would it's always good to go back to see how Bloomsbury, and particularly with the Amiga workshops, how you might be political with your home, but also have fun with it, and sort of enjoy the home that you are inhabiting, as opposed to a lot of the grey that we might see today.
Yes, you paint every surface.
Exactly.
Frances.
I think that's a lovely thing to say, and I do think when I myself feel fairly much happy and rested is often, of course, at home. And what is it about the home? You know, it's certain things being in certain places, certain colours, all sorts of things. It's terribly important. But on the larger view of Bloomsbury, of course, it is an importance that they introduced a certain understanding of the need for tolerance and personal freedom much more. And I mean, if you think of someone like Leonard Woolf, who we haven't mentioned before, he never published a novel purely for commercial reasons. You know, he was an advisor to the Labour Party on international politics. His whole life was dedicated to an extraordinary giving to the world in various ways. And you can't mingle with people like that without being, I think, influenced by them. When we pick up Virginia Woolf's books and things and read them, we're definitely changed by them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that seems a suitable place to end. I think there's so much more. We could have had a much longer discussion. So I'm sorry to have cut you all off in your prime. Perhaps we'll have a follow-up at some point in the future. Thank you all very much to our three guests, to Frances, to Grace, and to John. I'd also like to thank Reka for her behind-the-scenes assistance, and to say, please join us at the same time next week for a talk on women sculptors by Professor Fran Lloyd. And don't forget to come and see Vanessa Bell's beautiful interior and many other artworks at the Shiver exhibition at Benery Gallery. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been a real pleasure.